And now I want to welcome Steve Friend to the P.A.S. report. So before I talk to Steve, make sure that you like and follow the podcast and go to the P.A.S. report website, pasreport.com. I'm going to have all the links up to follow Steve. Now, Steve has a remarkable story to tell. He is a former supervisory FBI special agent. He's a whistleblower. He is the author of True Blue. It's a fantastic book that explains his journey throughout his service leading up to this moment that we're about to talk about. So Steve, welcome to the program. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me.
I'm glad you could be here because there's so much going on. And one of the things that has concerned me over the years, I actually have a background in emergency management and homeland security. I am someone that was always concerned with things like the Patriot Act and how it could expand. But it fell on deaf ears. A lot of people weren't paying attention to the growing government apparatus and the abuses of power that were taking place. You're someone that was on the front lines, decided to speak out, and were punished for it. So I want to hear your story. Can you tell the audience what happened to you?
Yeah, so I was in the FBI beginning in 2014 and spent 7 years in the Midwest working on Indian reservations. And during that time, that's sort of important for my story because I had the opportunity to get very familiar with the way the FBI does its investigations. I opened about 200 cases, arrested about 150 subjects, and wound up going to trial about 7 or 8 times. So that was a good experience that I brought with me. Then when I transferred in 2021 to Florida, to Daytona Beach, and was intending to work on child pornography and human trafficking. Did that for several months, but then was essentially voluntold to work on domestic terrorism. And in my office, that meant January 6th investigations, which at that point were 9 or 10 months old. And it was really the first opportunity that I'd had to even look at those cases. And it was very apparent to me that the FBI has departed immensely from its typical rules and guidance for carrying investigations forward. And I did some thinking about that and digging and asking questions. And it was clear that that was intended to manipulate the domestic terrorism statistics that the FBI uses and puts out to the public. So we take one case, which is January 6th, with however many people are intended to be investigated by Washington field office where the event occurs, and instead decide to open up a separate case for every single person, depending on where they live. So in my case, if they live in Daytona Beach, I assign it to our office. Now, that creates this illusion that domestic terrorism is around the country when it's really not. It's somebody who was walking through the Capitol for the most part. It's not an ongoing national security threat. But the major departure then was that there was still a task force that was stood up in Washington, D.C. that was calling the shots and telling us what to do on our own cases. And I became concerned that even if it's a righteous investigation and I go to trial, and I've gone to trial several times, I know that there are pitfalls there that the defense attorney will pick apart. And if we are not buttoned up in those cases, then I'm not comfortable being the case agent on them. And I brought those concerns forward, in addition to the fact that we were going to be using some very aggressive means to bring these subjects into custody. Some of them were accused of misdemeanors. Even the guys that were accused of felonies had pledged to be cooperative with our offices and surrender in the event of criminal charges. Nevertheless, the leadership in my division saw fit to send large operations with dozens of agents, or in the case of the felony subject, to send a SWAT team to his house. And this was a year and a half after he had actually been interviewed by the FBI and had any contact with our office. And I thought that that presented a Waco type of scenario where you're going to catch this guy off guard, and just put myself in his shoes. He thought that 18 months has passed. He's probably not sweating it anymore. And then there's bang, bang, bang on the door, and he could easily wind up in an armed engagement with law enforcement. So it's a safety risk for him. It's a safety risk for us. Brought those concerns, all those forward to my frontline supervisor and up the chain of command. And they were not receptive to that and told me I was risking and jeopardizing my career with expressing any concerns of that nature. And they facilitated my removal from office via suspending my security clearance as opposed to actually punishing me for whistleblowing, which is illegal. They found a way around that. And they said that I improperly looked at the employee handbook, and they suspended my security clearance and walked me out the door 30 days after I made my first disclosure.
That's insane to me. And correct me if I'm wrong. So you were tasked from Washington. They were given orders to the field offices to go out, investigate, and arrest these people. But the cases were being prosecuted in Washington, D.C., were they not? so all power was being transferred to DC, or were they prosecuting these cases in the jurisdiction where these people were arrested?
They have to prosecute them from DC. They have the jurisdiction because that's where the offense happens. So logically, it would fall to those agents. Now, the rules do allow you to move the case to a different office just for logistical reasons, especially if it's a terrorist case. Let's say it's an actual cell of terrorists that did something in Washington and are now relocated and they're in the Daytona Beach office area. It would make sense to have those agents down there investigating it as opposed to guys up in Washington, D.C. that were continually telling us what to do. It logistically would have been difficult. But they took that, and it's atypical. The major departure, though, was the fact that there was this task force that existed and was giving us directives on our own cases. So we, in one case, I'd had to do an interview with an individual who was under investigation. He'd walked into the Capitol, no violence, no damage to property, had admired artwork for a few minutes and then walked out, and actually gotten permission from the Capitol Police to do so. And he was in a lawyer's office. He was under investigation. He'd already lost his job because of the political whirlwinds that were surrounding this case. And we could not tell him if he was going to be charged with the case because we were not interfacing with the federal prosecutor. We were interfacing with a Washington agent who would then go to the federal prosecutor, and they were deciding on what to do. And there were conversations that were had where they said, we haven't decided yet. We're going to go back through the legal code book and see if we can find anything else that we can charge.
And is that highly unusual to have that middle person actually communicating with the prosecutor rather than the agents that are actually on the ground doing the investigation?
100%, because just the case agent is supposed to have full investigative authority to carry an investigation forward as they deem fit and appropriate to take all necessary steps. So logically, they would have the most information that they could present to a federal prosecutor and actually do, if there's the prosecutor says, hey, I like your case, can you do a few more items for me? The case agent's the person that does that. But instead, we were getting these directives from these guys in Washington. And if they wanted to have the case, they could have had the case. They could have sent directives to us to do things like surveillance, interview, even go arrest. But their name would have been on it. They would have been calling the shot. Instead, they put my name on it. And as an experienced FBI agent, I'm not going to court if I know that my case is not buttoned up. And I know that a first-year defense attorney who's first-year law student who knows that would be able to rip me to shreds. If I use the wrong color evidence tape, that's a problem. You have to document the reason for the error, because a defense attorney would say, hey, Agent Friend, you used the wrong color tape. What else did you not follow when you did the case against my client? So there's a showman's aspect to it, and I'm familiar with that. And so many of these people that work in the national security sphere have never gone to trial or even conducted a real righteous investigation of a subject.
It's mind-boggling how this all transpired, and it was so quick. So, I mean, looking at domestic terrorism, one of the things that always concerned me the last few years, obviously, you have Al-Qaeda and ISIS being a less of a threat. They still exist, but we know that they're less of a threat. They have less capabilities than before. So you have to keep funding this beast, right? If there's no real threat, people will question, why are we funding to the tune of over $1 trillion a year in this massive bureaucracy that's law enforcement intelligence? When you look at domestic terrorism, one of the things that concerned me was in June of 2021, the Department of Justice issued the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. And in that document, it talks about anyone expressing anti-government or anti-authority sentiment could potentially be a domestic violent extremist. Several months later, we got the school board memo stating that parents complaining at school board because they were outraged over what their children were learning, well, they have the potential to be investigated under the Patriot Act. That's what they wanted to investigate them under. Now, Christopher Wray, the FBI director, testified just a few weeks ago that he never, ever, ever saw any evidence to justify targeting parents at school boards, and that the FBI never investigated parents at school boards. In your testimony before Congress, you stated that you were sent to the parking lot of these school board meetings to take down license plates. So the FBI director, what's the problem there? I mean, obviously, to me, he's committing perjury. Now, he could weasel his way out and say that he didn't order you personally to go. But who was the one that ordered you to go to the school parking lots to take down the license plates address?
It was a conversation that was had because the subject that was under surveillance already was a January 6th subject. And there was online chatter, I guess, that was intercepted. And now we have to question, because of the FISA abuses, how that was intercepted. And because this school board meeting was expected to be contentious and he was active in his community, not criminal, just had gone to the Capitol, but he was going to go to the school board meeting and go there to support that effort because this pornographic material had been uncovered and it was supposed to be pretty contentious. So my squad was sent over there and assigned to surveil him from his home, which we knew, because that's a whole nother aspect to this. We had these cases that existed for years and we had nothing to do because we're waiting for Washington, D.C. to tell us what to do. So we would go do surveillance to keep the case fresh. Every 90 days, you have to have something done on a case. So we would just drive by his house on the way home from work and say, yeah, I did surveillance. Nothing was learned by that, but we did surveillance of him, watched him drive from his home to the school board meeting, which was going to be held at the city hall, and documented anybody who he was having contact with in the parking lot, recorded their license plates. And that's really the evolution of the FBI from law enforcement into intelligence gathering. So now we have an intelligence investigation on those individuals. We could spin something up and say they had contact with a potential domestic violent extremist. We should open up an intelligence gathering investigation on this person, which is very circular. You gather intelligence, and that's the victory in itself, to gain more intelligence. You can always gain more intelligence and develop more contacts and spin off other intelligence investigations. And this has really been the fruition of what started after 9/11, when the FBI became this terrorist combating agency via the Patriot Act and all the funding that it got. But because that threat was abroad and was stomped down through counterinsurgency measures by our military, the FBI had to justify its budget, had to justify its existence and all the manpower and resources that it has at its fingertips. So then it shifted its focus to homegrown violent extremists, who were the Muslim Americans who might have sympathy for Al-Qaeda and ISIS and Al-Shabaab. And we heard for decades from left-wing media that the FBI was entrapping Muslim Americans who were vulnerable to this, who were not predisposed to committing any sort of terrorist acts. And the FBI was targeting them and roping them in and trapping them, ensnaring them into a domestic terrorist case that they could use to justify their existence. Now it's evolved because of the pressure from the White House and the administration that domestic violent extremism, which is just this nefarious but not really specific term that they're going to paint with their political rivals, who are, they say, anti-government. Well, the country was founded by 56 people who were sort of anti-government, so it's a little innocuous of a term to me. And they say white supremacist. So you look at the top 4 priorities for counterterrorism now within the FBI. 2 of them are anti-government and white supremacist. And those are the 2 labels that Joe Biden, in the September speech in front of Independence Hall, the red speech, that's how he characterized
the dark speech.
Republicans. Yes.
He was unhinged in that speech. And we look at it, so it's like a twofer, right? I mean, so now we investigate January 6th. He goes to a school board meeting. Well, there's another threat tag that we could put on other people and inflate the numbers even more and ever expand this idea of domestic terrorism, when realistically, has there been actual evidence of an expansion in white supremacy ideology, white supremacist organizations and groups? And how come, if it's that big of a threat, we don't know any of the groups that exist? I mean, you know, when we look at, and I always bring this up, when we look at the Italian mafia, I mean, I could name you the 5 families in New York that the FBI puts out there. They put out the flow charts of the command and control structure, the operational capabilities. Who are these white supremacist groups that we actually never hear about?
They're a figment of the imagination of the people that are screaming about it. And you look at the terrorist statistics as they've come in. Now, look, not going to discount any deaths that there as a result of a white supremacist, but statistically, it's 50% lower than lightning strikes in this country. So it's an incredibly rare occurrence that, and even then I have to question the manipulation that goes into attribute white supremacy to what could just be a regular crime of violence.
Well, let's look at it this way. So you are involved in human trafficking investigations. When it comes to investigations, what happens on a more routine basis? Human trafficking or white supremacy, white supremacist groups spreading their ideology and committing violence and targeting groups of people?
Oh, it's definitely human trafficking. And the problem then goes back to what I was talking about with these intelligence investigations. Take a group like Patriot Front, which well, people argue it might be just a complete government ruse, but let's just say it's legitimate. Let's say these guys are white supremacist, nationalist, or whatever ideology. What are they actually doing other than marching around like a bunch of idiots? There's no violence, yet it has spun up media attention. And now I would assume multiple investigations around the country of any sort of arms or networks that are tied to Patriot Front. And the purpose of those is not to disrupt any sort of terrorist activity. It's just to watch them and gain intelligence on them. And that's really not in keeping with what federal law enforcement is supposed to do. That's what an intelligence apparatus does. And
that's so key. And I just want to interrupt you right there. I think that's so key what you just said, that it's not to disrupt the group. So they're pointing to this group, saying that this group is a threat, yet they're not taking down the group to try and take away that threat. Why is that the case? I mean, that's mind-boggling on this. Law enforcement, you're supposed to interrupt the criminal activity that's going on. Are they waiting for something to happen in order to just, and I know that's speculation, so I want to make that clear. It is speculation, but it appears that they're waiting for something to happen so they could come out and justify, see, we told you this threat of white supremacy exists. We told you domestic terrorism is the biggest threat we face. That's what it appears on the outside.
I think you've nailed it. And they're sitting there and waiting, and they are not getting the payoff, which is why they jump on these stories as they come in, and they'll say, "Oh, he's a Mexican white supremacist," or anything they
white
can.
Hispanic.
Yes. Or they had the Turkish citizen that drove up with a brand spanking new Nazi flag to the White House in a truck. And
well, we had a case in New York where it was a black man got on a train. He shot people. Thankfully, nobody died on that. And they said that he was driven by white supremacist ideology. That's how insane we've gotten to.
That's where we're at. And it's there's a political angle to it, obviously, that they can cast half of the country who votes the other way that they don't like in that fashion. But there's also the bureaucratic aspect to it that's tied to funding and personal enrichment, and that is in integrated program management, which is 10 years old. IPM, it's a quota system that exists in the FBI. It dictates a number of cases they have to open, and arrests and tools that they have to use in any given year to justify their existence. And it creates this perverse incentive, because your local sheriff gets elected because he brings the crime numbers down. And if he doesn't, he gets booted out of office. But the FBI is completely incentivized to bring the crime numbers up so they can demonstrate how good they $10 billion. Now give us 11, Congress, or 12. And by hitting these quota figures, the senior executives in the FBI get bonuses of $30,000 to $50,000 each. And this is annual.
And these are civil servants. You take a job of civil service not to become rich and wealthy, not to receive bonuses, but to give back and help out a community. It's amazing. Precisely.
And then you get into the work smarter and not harder aspect to it, which is back to January 6th. That's one case. But they saw the opportunity to open up thousands of cases and spread them around the country. So you have the political narrative that domestic terrorism is around the country when it's really not. And all of those senior executives got boosts to their domestic terrorism numbers in each of one of their divisions because they all hit their quota figures, and they've kept this going and going. And IPM is about 10 years old. The number of domestic terrorism cases has quadrupled in this country in the last 10 years. Have you seen a 4x increase in actual legitimate attacks? And I'll give you one more figure. There's a completely artificial, contrived statistic that the FBI invented for itself called disruption. It essentially means I disrupted a organization's criminal acts. So last year, the FBI had a goal bureau-wide. They wanted to have 600 disruptions of domestic terrorist groups. They only got 397. That means every day of the year and twice on Sunday, the FBI disrupted a domestic terrorist organization. That's patently false.
Absolutely.
There's not a chance in the world, because look, I worked in government. Incompetence is rampant. There would have been a few that fell through the cracks, and they don't, because they don't exist. And the ones that you could even be slightly contrived to be a domestic terrorist attack, that gets amped up so that they can say, see, look, there is a legitimate threat, and it just doesn't exist. And that's a good thing. We live in a relatively safe country.
Yeah, it is. And people should be happy about that. Unfortunately, there are some that are miserable about it. Now, you were suspended because you voiced your concerns. So you got your clearance revoked, from suspended. And they also cut off your paycheck, correct?
Yes, I was put into an indefinite unpaid suspension while they analyzed and investigated whether or not I was worthy of having a security clearance after my horrible sin of looking at the employee handbook.
Okay, so now I want to make this clear to everyone. These are numbers. It's straight from the Government Accountability Office, where over the last few years, over 1,400 federal employees were suspended for 3 months and they still received their pay. You have over 2,000 employees suspended for 1 month and still received their pay. You had an unnamed official at the Department of Homeland Security being suspended for over 700 days over the course of a 3-year period. I mean, think about that logically. That's 2 out of the 3 years. They're home doing nothing. They're not working. And yet they were still able to collect your paycheck. So were you targeted to inflict as much pain on you and your family by cutting your pay in order to silence you and shut you up?
Yes, and to make an example of me. And that is the first usurpation that I faced. And it's not the worst.
What is the worst?
I was walked out of the office on September 19th of 2022. Within a few weeks, my wife mysteriously lost her job under some very suspicious circumstances. And then her social media accounts were shut down for violating community standards, even though she doesn't do any public posting on social media. The New York Times was given my medical records and told that I was under disciplinary investigation for shooting a firearm in my backyard. Then the FBI refused to give me my training documents, which I requested because I was looking at doing law enforcement in the state of Florida and needed those. And they told me I had to FOIA my own documents. And then when I said that the law says they have to give them to me, they gave me some of them. And then when the state of Florida went to verify they're accurate and not fraudulent, the FBI said, we can't confirm or deny that those are real. So they rendered them useless. They sent me an email that told me that there was a gag order placed on me, that I wasn't allowed to speak out to my wife, to my attorney about anything. I was compelled to go to a security division interview with 3 agents. And in that, they attempted to get me in a lie, in a perjury trap, basically, and lying to a federal agent trap, so that they could execute a search warrant and charge me with a felony and come and arrest me for that. And I requested multiple times to have outside employment, that you can have that. You have to get their permission because you're still technically an FBI employee. You're limited to $7,500 per year, but I guess it's better than nothing. And they rejected those within 1 day. I was told it would take 90 days to really assess it, but within 1 day, those were rejected. So this has just been ongoing on their part. And I would say finally, look, I sat home, was idle and nothing to do. I had a book publisher contact me and say they wanted my story. I refused to take an advance because I don't care about the money. I just wanted the message to get out. So I wrote a book, went through the publish and editing process, and the FBI said they wanted me to redact essentially my entire book. I couldn't talk about anything about whistleblowing, anything that was publicly available, like the disclosure that I made, anything about my involvement with the Gretchen Whitmer case, which I was involved with, and anything about my meeting with executives during which they tried to compel me to violate civil rights. So all of that happens and eventually has to culminate with me where I did have a job offer for this group you see behind me in the banner, which is Center for Renewing America. They offered me a fellowship to work for their organization and advise the weaponization committee on so many of these things. And I resigned February 15th, the morning that I testified in a transcribed interview. And I was content to accept the job and just not tell the FBI I was resigning and just hold both simultaneously. But my attorney said that they would contrive a way to charge me with a criminal charge if I actually did that. So I resigned and I'm now a former recovering FBI agent.
And it shows you how vindictive they are. It shows you how much has actually changed at the FBI. You know, it amazes me because when you hear FBI leadership talk and they're being questioned, especially about a controversial topic, they always get amnesia saying, I don't recall, I don't recount, not to my recollection, I don't know. And yet it seems that if you use those same responses, they would try and tag you and get you in a perjury trap. When you say that they wanted to violate other civil rights, can you explain that to the audience?
Yeah, I mean, it was essentially my concerns that I brought to the lieutenants, if you will, of my division about the January 6 cases. And I said, look, we're violating our processes. And this is a Giglio issue. We're not handing this information over that they can cross-examine us as the agents on the case. It could be Brady material. And I also feel that we're violating people's cruel and unusual punishment rights, because these people have been locked up in a gulag for a couple of years without a speedy trial. Or we're going and interviewing these people who we don't even know if we're going to charge with a crime. What's the point of that? Well, to make them pay an attorney and to really punish them. And I think that that constitutes a violation of somebody's civil rights. Now, the thing about the Federal Whistleblower Protection Act, 5 U.S.C. 2303, it says, I don't have to be right. I just have to be reasonable. And I think that I've articulated a pretty reasonable concern. But in that meeting with those gentlemen there, they told me that I had an oath of office, which I expressed to them that I felt that was our actions were a violation of our oath of office. I felt that they were a violation of our training. I went, as part of your training in the FBI, all employees go to the Holocaust Memorial and they go to the MLK Memorial. And the purpose is to hammer home that those sort of abuses of civil rights and genocide and any atrocity like that can only happen if law enforcement becomes weaponized and is a political apparatchik for an out-of-control government. So it's incumbent on you to throw the flag if you see any evidence of that whatsoever. And I said, I'm in keeping with my oath, I'm in keeping with my training. And my executive management told me, you have a right to come forward, you have an oath, but you have a duty to the FBI and you have to do what we tell you to do.
And that's amazing, because your loyalty is not supposed to be to any government institution. And that's what makes me concerned about everything I'm witnessing. And again, I'll go back to the National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. It says any type of anti-government or anti-authority sentiment. It's not anti-American sentiment. So you could bash the United States all you want. You could threaten the United States all you want. That's fine. But you can't threaten those in power. You can't criticize the agencies and the departments that exist within government. Now, you wrote a few pieces because this needs to be reformed. I mean, these are very powerful institutions that could destroy lives. I mean, just look at you. And we see it happening to others as well. As far as reforms go, I mean, you have the leadership within the intel and law enforcement communities on the federal level that have bucked Congress for so long. They show no respect for congressional powers of oversight. You just wrote an article about this, and you said there is a solution to that. So whenever the FBI disregards Congress and subpoenas and information that's being requested, you brought up a pretty good solution. Can you explain it to the audience?
Yes, I mean, and certainly the Congress has lawful authority, oversight authority of the FBI. So this whole thing where Christopher Wray says, I can't comment on that, or I have to protect my sources and methods, or my personal new favorite, and that is where he says, we're not in the business of. So they'll say, here's objective evidence that the FBI committed this violation. And he says, well, we're not in the business of doing that. And so I guess I can just go spend all my money on hookers and blow. And when I come home, tell my wife, I'm not in the business of being Hunter Biden, and that should be good, right?
Like, or you could leave cocaine in the White House. Who knows? I mean, you know.
But seriously, I believe that a way, if you're not going to eliminate the FBI, and I don't think there's a lot of political appetite from most Republicans who are in a position to actually make that happen, they can sort of split the baby with the people that want it to exist and those who wanted to fund it. And I would say, let's disarm the FBI. And we can do that through the appropriations process and make it a Bureau of Investigations with unarmed investigators, which there already are within the federal government. The special agent is a label that is pop culture. It's what the FBI calls you. You're an 1811 criminal investigator. Those exist in the ATF, the DEA, U.S. Marshals. That's the same designation. There's an 1810 designation, and that's an unarmed investigator. And typically they don't look into criminal matters. They look into regulatory issues. So I think that we can create maybe a hybrid model called an 1812. And that will be an unarmed criminal investigator. And then also through appropriations, force the FBI to get the permission of the local agency where the investigation is going to happen. So the sheriff can say, okay, you want to investigate Nick. I see enough here that maybe we should look into that. You guys have my blessing to investigate. And also you must partner with a representative from that agency. And we're going to deputize the detectives and at the sheriff's offices and the deputies who already are detectives and have local knowledge and have been working in those offices for years on end and know how to do investigations, and they know where the problems are in their area. And that's proof of concept already exists for that. Those are called task force officers. They get sworn in by the U.S. Marshal Service. They get federal arrest authority on top of their state arrest authority. And you would partner with that individual and do your investigation. And then finally, if it comes time to effect an arrest, that local authority, again, that local agency will have the ability to nix that and say, no, we don't believe that we should do this, effect this arrest, because they're the only ones with the guns. There's no FBI SWAT team that's going to come knocking your door, because there's not going to be an FBI SWAT team that exists. And that creates the bulwark.
You mean we don't need 40 agents coming in on boats and helicopter taking down a 79-year-old man?
Check in the box. Oh, those are all new agents. They have to go on a certain number of arrest operations to get off of probation. That's always what it is. You can see the videos. They always have brand spanking new armor. They're all new agents, which is exactly what you want in that sort of situation. Lots of new people who are going to be stressed out. But back to my point, there's a bulwark there because your sheriff is accountable to you more directly than the FBI director. And that will allow the states to essentially staff and provide the personnel to the federal law enforcement apparatus, very analogously to the way we used to elect senators prior to the 17th Amendment, where that came from the state house. So they're more accountable to the local population who are their constituents. And that will rein in any sort of FBI weaponization and disarmament. Let's just take away the fangs. So that it doesn't matter who's the president. They can't go after his rival.
And they're less ideological. It's not about the political weaponization. That's one thing that was amazing. Watching the hearings with you and the way you were treated by many members of Congress who should be ashamed of themselves, but particularly Democrats. One thing that I don't understand is, don't they realize that the apparatus could turn on them at any time?
I think they do. I mean, they'd have to if they have, a brain between their ears. But I mean, it's questionable with some of them, like Debbie Wasserman Schultz. But I think that they believe that they hold the levers of power. And whether or not they're in the majority or not, the Republicans are not going to push back on that. The Republicans view the hearing as the victory. They're not really looking for any sort of consequences out of this. They've had very little interaction with me after that fact. I had one text message saying, like, just checking in on you. There's been nothing. There's been no recommendations to this. And
no follow-ups whatsoever to get more information?
No. And look, the hearing is a Broadway show.
Of course.
The rehearsal is when they had me come in for a deposition, when they were supposed to issue their subpoenas. That's when they learn the information. They go out to perform their show. And that is for the American people who are not in those depositions, who are not privy to those subpoenas. Present the facts to the people to galvanize an appetite to actually take action. But instead, they just view the opportunity to get their 3-minute clip or to get their fundraising email out or get them on Fox News tonight. And that is not going to reform the agency in any meaningful way. And it's just a lost opportunity because, look, I don't want to toot my own horn very much, but I'm an experienced person when it comes to testifying. Like, I've testified hundreds of times. That room didn't make me nervous. I've testified in front of juries and grand juries. I'm prepared to be direct examined by the prosecutor and cross-examined by the defense. In that case, it would have been the Democrats. I would have kept my composure. They thought I was going to stand up and flip the table over or something. I don't know. Said, you guys, I do this for a living. That's this room doesn't do that to me. They should have had one voice, one person, and they all should have sacrificed their opportunity to get on Fox tonight and nominated one person as the prosecutor to walk the witnesses through the information that we had to present for the jury, who are the American people. And then every 5 minutes, they take a break and let a Democrat come up and question my patriotism or call me a grifter who has made no money, by the way.
Well, there's accusations, that you're getting paid by Trump himself almost, that it's Trump paying you and giving you money to live. So we could dispel those now, right? Yeah,
you certainly can. I mean, look, I was suspended without pay. And if you want to suggest that I sacrificed my 6-figure career for my dream career in the hopes that I would get $5,000 charitable donation from a whistleblower charity several months later, then I have to question your sanity, Mr. Dan Goldman.
Let's be honest here. So if you went before Congress and lied, that's perjury. The Garland Department of Justice, I have a feeling that they would kick down your door fairly quickly and arrest you if you lied about anything.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look, they tried to charge Garrett O'Boyle next to me, they suggested that there should be criminal charges against him because in his deposition, he said that he believed that the whistleblower charity was paying for his lawyer. He said, I don't pay for my lawyer. I think the charity is picking that up. And the truth of the matter was that lawyer was working pro bono. And they said that Garrett lied about that. But one, he didn't lie because he didn't know. And two, the charitable effort of an attorney outside of his knowledge does not mean that he's committing perjury. But they're going to lean on whatever they can to discredit the witnesses because they want the headline. They get their sycophants in the media to say alleged whistleblower, which is another thing they like to say, alleged whistleblower accused of this sort of malfeasance, and most people don't read beyond the headlines.
Well, the alleged whistleblower is equivalent to the white Hispanic.
Yeah, alleged whistleblower. Or
the black person that's engaged in white supremacy.
I think my only regret, my major regret from testimony was I didn't have the opportunity to say the name Eric Ciaramella, who was the hero whistleblower for the Trump impeachment about the Ukrainian phone call, and they were not allowed to speak his name. He was like Voldemort, and they would lose their mind because they had to protect his integrity because he was a whistleblower. Said he brought his concerns forward, right or wrong. He had a reasonable concern. He's a whistleblower by letter of the law, as am I. And you can question my patriotism. You can call me a conspiracy theorist. You can call me a grifter. Can't help but notice you never said I was wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's an important point. Yeah, the most important point. Now, I speak to former FBI agents, people that retired. One of them was actually the head of the Eastern District, New York. They discussed it at what they're seeing. Have any former agents reached out to you? I know the current agents, you're like a leper. Nobody talks to you anymore. But as far as former agents go, is there any type of organization where you could seek out help from other people? I mean, I don't know why more aren't speaking out. It's really frightening and terrifying to see all this power being used in the executive branch, the abuses of power, Congress not realizing that as the executive branch gets more powerful, they're losing power. And it's really frustrating to watch where there's no accountability within the system at all.
Yeah, the retired agent community, I've had a lot of them reach out to me. And look, that to me is the best compliment I could get is when I hear a guy who did his 20 to 30 years and says you're old school bureau. That to me, I don't need to be, I don't need anything else. I don't need the shadow box with all the challenge coins or anything in it. Getting that sort of compliment from somebody who actually did it the right way, I think is the most meaningful thing that I could get. So I've had a lot of encouragement from a lot of these retired guys. I think a lot of them though are sort of, they think that the FBI is maybe incompetent or in some ways, or has poor leadership, but it can be corrected. I've come around on the fact that it's just an evil organization. It's no longer an objective force for good. And I truly believe that it has to be thrown away. Its reputation is so sullied in large, significant portions of this country that, like, I have to go speak in Collier County in a few weeks, and that's Naples area. That area voted, I think, 93% Republican in the last election. You're telling me any FBI prosecution that goes to trial down there in that jury pool, they should just quit right away because they have to assume the FBI manufactured the evidence or there's something there, because they're not going to take the FBI seriously anymore. And that's a damage that I don't think you can overcome.
Well, that's why they need the trials in DC, right? I mean, that's the only way and you look at it, so 37% of the American people, new poll came out, 37% of the American people actually have trust and faith in the FBI. And I think that's huge because that says that this isn't a partisan issue. The overwhelming majority of Americans, Republican, Independent, and Democrat, question the integrity of the FBI now. That is unrepairable. They're not going to be able to repair that.
They're not. And look, this is the big question that Christopher Wray is always confronted with by media and then by Congress when he testified. And they say, look, there's these numbers of approval have just fallen off a cliff here. What do you attribute that to? Because that's under your leadership, sir. And his response to that, I think, is very interesting. He says that they have a record number of applicants for jobs and their retention rate is very hard. And my response to that is, let me get this straight. If you are running the FBI, let's just say you're running a restaurant and your customers, who are the American people, if you're the FBI, or your customers at the restaurant say, every time I eat your food, I get food poisoning. I don't like your restaurant. and you say back to them, well, I have a record number of people who want to become waiters here. That is somebody who is not making the logical steps to, or taking seriously the information that's being brought before him, because he knows it's indefensible. And Christopher Wray, you know, as much as he was nominated by a Republican president at the request of Chris Christie, he left a $9.2 million job to go work as the FBI director for about $200,000. Now, personally, he did that. I think he'll be enriched on the back end. He gets to live like a billionaire flying in a private jet. But let's just look at the dollars and cents aspect to that. He gave up $9 million a year for a 10-year assignment. 9 times 10 is 90. He sacrificed $90 million in earnings for the cause. And I think that just demonstrates what ideology and what true conviction means to individuals who are willing to weaponize the apparatus of the government against the people.
And when they look at themselves as the guardians of democracy, and they're willing to violate every aspect of the Constitution and ignore the Constitution, that's what makes them so dangerous. Steve, I really appreciate you coming on to talk to the audience. I want to keep this conversation going and have you back. Everyone, I have the links up to all Steve's work at the PAS Report website, pasreport.com. Steve, thank you for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me today.